Lena Morrison and James Owens had always been pillars of the small town of Ravenswood, beloved by all who knew them. But when their bodies were found, each with a scarlet mask placed carefully over their faces, the town was thrust into a nightmare that would expose its darkest secrets, secrets that had been buried for decades and were now rising from the ashes with a vengeance. In the fall of 2018, the small town of Ravenswood, tucked away in a quiet corner of the countryside, became the site of a chilling and inexplicable crime spree. The town had always been peaceful, its people friendly, and its streets calm. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where neighbors waved at each other, and where the worst things that ever happened were minor traffic accidents or lost pets. But everything changed one cold October morning when the body of Lena Morrison, the town's beloved librarian, was found in her home under circumstances no one could have imagined. Lena was 52 years old and was buried in her home cemetery without ever being buried. Lena was discovered by her cleaning lady, who arrived at the house to find the front door ajar. At first she thought nothing of it. Lena often forgot to lock up after long days at the library. But when she entered the house, she was struck by an overwhelming silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if something was terribly wrong. As she ventured through the rooms, the sight that awaited her in the study was enough to freeze her in place. 11. Lena was seated at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. At first glance it seemed like she had simply passed away in her sleep, but then the details became undeniable. A scarlet mask, a soft velvet thing adorned with crimson beads, was placed carefully over her face. Her eyes, wide open and lifeless beneath the mask, stared forward with an unsettling emptiness. The mask, unfamiliar and strange, did not belong to Lena. Suddenly alarmed, she looked around with straining eyes. There was no sign of forced entry into the home, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. The police were baffled. Detective Megan Hayes was called to the scene, though she had never encountered anything like this before. The mask was a peculiar touch, one that made no sense in the context of a murder. There were no fingerprints on the mask, no obvious signs of a struggle, and no weapon was found. Lena's death appeared to be a mystery wrapped in an enigma. At first, the community was in shock, unable to comprehend how something like this could happen in their town. The people of Ravenswood were quick to speculate, each theory more bizarre than the last. Some thought it was a robbery gone wrong, though the police quickly dismissed that idea, as Lena's belongings were untouched. Others whispered about a strange, mysterious figure seen lurking around town in recent weeks. But no one could provide a concrete description. The mask, though, was the one detail that kept haunting them. The next few days brought more fear than answers. The town's sense of security shattered as rumors spread about the mask. Some believed it was a symbol of something darker, something hidden in Ravenswood's past. But no one could say for sure. Then, just as the community began to calm down, a second body was found. This time it was James Owens, a local carpenter known for his quick wit and easygoing nature. His body was discovered in the woods near his home, similarly posed with the same scarlet mask placed over his face. The pattern was undeniable now. Two people, both beloved members of the community, had been found in strange, unexplainable ways, both with the same eerie mask as the only clue. It was clear that something terrifying had come to Ravenswood, something with a message, something that wanted to be seen, and something that was just getting started. Detective Hayes knew that this was no ordinary case. and as the bodies began to pile up, she felt the weight of the town's growing fear pressing down on her. Whoever was behind the mask had only just begun. As Detective Megan Hayes continued her investigation into the bizarre murders plaguing Ravenswood, the town's dark and forgotten past began to surface. The more she looked into the victims, the more she realized that there was something hidden beneath the surface of this peaceful community. The deaths of Lena Morrison and James Owens had not been random. They were linked to something far older and more sinister than anyone had imagined. The town's history was rooted in a tragedy that few spoke of. Over a century ago, Ravenswood had been home to an orphanage, the Ravenswood Orphanage, a sprawling, isolated building on the outskirts of town that once housed dozens of children. The orphanage had been founded by a wealthy philanthropist, but the vision of a nurturing, safe home for children quickly turned into a nightmare. Conditions at the orphanage were harsh, and rumors of abuse and neglect surrounded the place. However, the town's leaders, intent on maintaining a good reputation, silenced any complaints, and the orphanage continued to operate under a veil of secrecy. Many of the children who passed through its doors were never seen again, their fates lost to time. Some disappeared without a trace, while others were simply forgotten, their names erased from records and their stories buried. Among these forgotten children was Samuel Cross, a boy who had spent most of his early life at the orphanage. Samuel was different from the other children. He was quiet, observant, and unusually intelligent for his age. But the orphanage staff, under the strict orders of the board, did everything they could to break him. They saw his resilience as a threat, an indication that he could not be easily controlled. Samuel endured physical and emotional abuse, and by the time he was old enough to leave, his spirit had been crushed, though his anger only grew. There were whispers among the workers that Samuel had been planning to escape, but one night he simply vanished. The town's records claimed that Samuel had been adopted, but the truth was that no one ever came forward to claim him. His disappearance was brushed aside, with people choosing to believe that he had found a better life somewhere else. Over the years, the orphanage was abandoned, and the building slowly deteriorated, its windows boarded up and its halls left to decay. But the past never truly disappears, and Ravenswood's ugly history continued to haunt the town. It was only after Lena Morrison's death that Detective Hayes stumbled upon the connection between the victims and the orphanage. She discovered that both Lena and James Owens had volunteered at the orphanage many years ago. Lena had worked as a young woman helping with the children, while James had been one of the local carpenters who had repaired the building. Neither had ever mentioned Samuel Cross, but the old workers' gossip about him painted a chilling picture. As Megan dug deeper, she uncovered more unsettling details. The mask left at the crime scenes, it seemed, had a deeper meaning. It was not just an odd symbol of the killer's intentions, but a reflection of Ravenswood's buried guilt. The mask resembled the one worn by the children during their most painful moments, during the brutal experiments they were subjected to by the orphanage staff. It became clear to Megan that the killer wasn't just seeking revenge. They were exposing the town's darkest secrets, one life at a time. The truth, buried for so long, was finally rising to the surface, and it was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. As Detective Megan Hayes dug deeper into the shadows of Ravenswood's past, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Though the picture they formed was far darker than she had anticipated, the more she learned about the orphanage and its troubled history, the more it became clear that the killer's motive wasn't just revenge. It was a crusade to expose the town's sins, to force it to face the horrors it had long since buried. The key to unraveling the mystery lay in Samuel Cross, the boy who had disappeared from the orphanage all those years ago. The journal Megan found in the ruins of the orphanage had been a crucial breakthrough. It belonged to one of the orphanage's workers, and its pages were filled with disturbing accounts of the children's treatment. Samuel's name appeared frequently in the journal, not just as one of the children, but as a symbol of everything the orphanage's staff had tried to break. Samuel was, in the eyes of the workers, a problem to be solved, a child whose very existence challenged their authority. But as Megan read on, something in the journal caught her attention, a reference to a specific incident involving Samuel. It described a night when the orphanage's headmaster had ordered an experiment that would change the boy's fate forever. The experiment was intended to test the limits of a child's endurance, to see how far they could be pushed before they broke. Samuel, who had always been defiant and strong-willed, had resisted in ways the staff couldn't control. The journal entry ended abruptly, leaving more questions than answers. Megan traced the name of the headmaster, Reginald Pierce, a man whose life had been shrouded in mystery after the orphanage's closure. He had been the one to oversee the cruel practices, the one who had been responsible for Samuel's suffering. But as she dug into Pierce's history, she found something else. He had vanished shortly after the orphanage closed down, his whereabouts unknown. She called him Megan's family and friends and gave them her exact. It seemed as though the man who had caused so much harm had disappeared without a trace, just like the children he had tormented. Megan also discovered that Lena Morrison and James Owens, the two victims already found, had both been involved with the orphanage during the years when Samuel was living there. Lena, though young, had volunteered at the orphanage, helping with the children in a capacity that seemed almost too personal, too involved. James Owens had been a carpenter who had spent a significant amount of time repairing parts of the orphanage, but neither had ever spoken publicly about their involvement. In fact, when asked, both had denied any real knowledge of the orphanage's dark past, though Megan began to suspect that they too had been hiding something. The breakthrough came when Megan visited the local historical society. There, in a dusty, forgotten corner of the archives, she found a photograph. A faded picture of a young Samuel Cross standing in front of the orphanage, his face defiant, his eyes filled with something that could almost be described as hatred. It was the only image of Samuel that remained, and it confirmed her worst fears. Samuel hadn't just been an orphan. He had been a witness to the brutality that took place behind those walls, and now, it seemed, he had returned to bring it all to light. Megan felt a cold shiver run down her spine as the realization set in. Samuel had never truly left Ravenswood. He had been hiding in plain sight, watching, waiting, and preparing for the moment when he would unmask the town's buried secrets. The Scarlet Mask was his way of marking his victims, people who had played a role in the atrocities that had occurred at the orphanage. Each murder was a grim reminder of the town's complicity in the horrors that had taken place all those years ago. The past had returned to haunt Ravenswood, and now it was up to Megan to stop it before more lives were claimed. But the more she uncovered, the more she began to wonder, was it too late to stop the past from coming back to claim its final toll? As the town of Ravenswood braced itself for more bloodshed, Detective Megan Hayes knew that time was running out. The pattern of the killings had become disturbingly clear. The Scarlet Mask, left behind at each crime scene, was not just a symbol of revenge, but of a carefully orchestrated plan. The killer wasn't targeting random victims. Each one had been tied to the orphanage, linked to the dark history that had once been buried beneath the town's serene facade. And now, with the murder of James Owens, it seemed there was only one person left to finish the puzzle: Martin Brooks, the local historian. Martin had recently published a book about Ravenswood's history, and while his work had been well received by the community, there was a creeping sense of unease around his investigation. Many of the townspeople believed Martin's book would stir up old wounds, and perhaps some were hoping that the past would remain forgotten. But Martin had become obsessed with uncovering the truth about Ravenswood, particularly the fate of Samuel Cross and the orphanage's gruesome legacy. His book, Shadows of Ravenswood, delved deep into the horrors of the orphanage, and Martin's findings had drawn attention from all the wrong places. As Megan continued to piece together the timeline, she discovered something chilling. Martin's research had led him closer and closer to the truth about Samuel Cross. He had tracked down the same journal that Megan had found in the ruins of the orphanage, and his findings had only deepened the mystery. It wasn't just Samuel's pain that had driven the killer. It was the desire to reveal the forgotten history of Ravenswood, to force the town to acknowledge its complicity in the atrocities that had taken place. Martin had been getting too close, and now he was marked as the final piece of the puzzle. It was on a stormy evening that the final victim was claimed. Megan received a call from Martin's wife, Clara, who was frantic and distraught. She had come home to find the front door wide open and Martin missing. She feared the worst. Megan's heart sank as she realized that they had finally reached the point where the killer would show their hand. And she wasn't sure anyone would be able to stop it. The aftermath of the disaster at the orphanage left Ravenswood forever changed. The ruins of the once ominous building stood as a reminder of the horrors it had concealed for so long. As the authorities combed through the wreckage, the discovery of Martin Brooks's body, along with the final remnants of Samuel Cross's tragic life, marked the end of the bloody spree. The Scarlet Mask, now destroyed in the collapse, symbolized the closing chapter of a chilling legacy. But the town could not shake the sense of unease that still lingered in the air. Detective Megan Hayes had always believed that uncovering the truth would bring justice, but as she watched the town struggle to come to terms with its past, she realized that some truths are too heavy to bear. The townspeople, many of whom had remained unaware of the dark history beneath their feet, were left to face the reality that they had been complicit in hiding a horrific secret. The killings had revealed not only the town's failure to protect its most vulnerable, but also the lengths to which people would go to bury their sins. Megan couldn't shake the image of Martin Brooks standing before the photograph of Samuel Cross in the orphanage. The eerie calm with which Martin had confronted her was unsettling, as though he had been waiting for this moment all his life. Samuel Cross had lived in the shadows, watching, learning, and planning, using Martin as the vessel for his vengeance. In the end, the identity of the killer wasn't just a personal vendetta against those involved with the orphanage, it was a quest to destroy the town's ability to forget. As Megan sifted through the final pieces of the investigation, she found a strange sense of closure, though it wasn't the kind she had expected. Ravenswood would go on, but it would never be the same. The scars left by Samuel's rage and by the killer who had emerged from the shadows of history would take generations to heal. The townspeople, though relieved that the nightmare had ended, now found themselves burdened with guilt, and they couldn't unsee what had been uncovered. Despite the horrors, some in Ravenswood tried to move forward, rebuilding their lives and attempting to patch the fractured relationships that had been strained by the truth. The memory of the Scarlet Mask became a symbol of the past they could not escape, and some of the younger residents, those born after the orphanage's closure, grew up hearing whispers about the mask and the murders. It had become a part of their shared history. For Megan, the case lingered in her mind, the haunting realization that sometimes the worst crimes are not those committed in the heat of the moment, but those that fester in silence over time. The town had been unaware of the atrocities at the orphanage, and its attempts to erase the past had only allowed the darkness to thrive in secret. As the years passed, Ravenswood would slowly regain a sense of normalcy, but it would never forget the Scarlet Mask. It had come to represent something far more than just a symbol of a killer's rage. It was a reminder that the past, no matter how buried, has a way of rising to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. And though the killer was gone, the mask would live on, an indelible mark on Ravenswood's conscience, forever tied to the town's darkest chapter. As she raced to Martin's home, a sudden thought hit her. The killer wouldn't leave anything to chance. Martin was likely being kept somewhere familiar, somewhere tied to the town's past. The old orphanage was the only place that fit. Megan made her way there, her mind racing with every possible scenario. As she approached the decaying building, she could see the faint glow of a candlelight flickering inside the windows. When Megan entered, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was thick with dust, and the building's once grand halls now seemed like a labyrinth of decay. She followed the light until it led her to the main chamber, where Martin was standing, staring at something on the wall, a large old photograph of the orphanage's children, their faces frozen in time. But one face stood out from the others: Samuel Cross. Before Megan could react, the sound of a door creaking echoed through the room. She turned quickly, only to find herself face to face with the killer. The Scarlet Mask, with its eerie, haunting beads, was now a symbol of Samuel Cross's enduring rage. The killer wasn't just after Martin. They wanted to make sure the truth would never be forgotten. But as the killer moved toward Martin, something unexpected happened. A struggle broke out, and in the chaos, Martin managed to break free. As he stumbled toward the door, the killer followed, and it wasn't until the last possible moment that Samuel Cross's true identity was revealed. Not as the child he once was, but as Martin himself. Samuel had spent years, even decades, hiding in plain sight, adopting a new identity, and the final victim was always meant to be the one who had been digging too deep. In the ensuing chaos, the building collapsed. Samuel, in his final act of revenge, perished in the wreckage. His death marked the end of the killing spree, but it left Ravenswood scarred. The Scarlet Mask, though lost in the rubble, would forever be a reminder of the past that had been forced into the light. The town was left to rebuild, but the legacy of its darkest secrets would never be forgotten. Ravenswood's history was no longer something that could be buried, and the truth, though painful, had finally come to light. Ravenswood, once a quiet and unassuming town, now carried an indelible mark that could never be erased. The people tried to go about their lives as best as they could, but the weight of the past hung over them like a dark cloud, casting shadows over every corner of the community. Even after the killer was revealed, even after the town had witnessed the collapse of the orphanage and the revelation of its horrors, the damage was done. Ravenswood was forever changed, and its residents knew it. In the months following the final tragedy, the streets that had once been filled with the sound of laughter and light-hearted conversation now felt empty, hollow. People looked over their shoulders more often, spoke in hushed tones, and avoided certain parts of town where the past had left its deepest scars. The orphanage site, now reduced to rubble, was the focal point of this unsettling transformation. While the building itself was gone, the memories of what had taken place there lingered, and the town found it difficult to forget the truth it had tried so desperately to conceal. Detective Megan Hayes, though relieved that the killings had stopped, found herself questioning the cost of that closure. As she continued to visit Ravenswood, she could feel the heavy atmosphere, the unspoken guilt that seemed to grip everyone. Some residents, particularly the older ones, expressed regret for having turned a blind eye to the suffering that had occurred under their noses. Others, particularly those who had known the victims, struggled with the knowledge that they had unknowingly been part of a system that had failed its most vulnerable. Ravenswood had once been a place where everyone knew everyone else, but now it was a town marked by isolation and mistrust. The town council, sensing the deepening divide, tried to take action. They initiated community programs, brought in counselors, and attempted to organize town meetings to address the pain and trauma that had been exposed. But the damage was too profound. There was no way to undo the horror that had unfolded, and no way to completely rebuild the trust that had been shattered. The local health department vocalized its worries about the future of town and the community. The Scarlet Mask had come to symbolize not just the killer's vendetta, but the town's collective silence and the deep-seated secrets it had worked so hard to keep buried. As years passed, some of the younger generation, those who had been born after the orphanage's closure, found themselves intrigued by the stories. They wanted to know more about the history of Ravenswood, the truth that had been hidden from them. While some embraced the past, others struggled with the knowledge of the town's dark legacy. The Scarlet Mask became a whispered legend, a chilling reminder that nothing, not even the most idyllic of towns, could escape the consequences of its buried secrets. Megan, now older and weary, often reflected on the case that had changed her life. She had uncovered the truth, but the truth had come at a terrible cost. Ravenswood was never the same, and neither was she. The experience had left its own scar, one that she couldn't quite shake. In the end, she realized that some towns, no matter how hard they try, can never truly move on from their past. Ravenswood had learned that lesson the hard way. The past had come alive, and no amount of time or effort would ever make it disappear. The town was forever changed, and its scarlet mark would never fade.